Way to get us started, Dave?
Yeah, whenever you want, really.
Yes, then, no, absolutely. So first of all, and everybody should know, but we are recording this.
Mm.
So I was planning to, in an edited version, to release it after the meeting, just so everyone knows. And then, Dave, I'm really pleased you said yes to this, because at least for me, the field of strategy is very fascinating. There's something going on, not that I even believe I have fully understood it, but you are one of the people who stand out as the one who is really pushing the envelope on this. So the two questions that were asked, and I'll leave it to yourself to introduce you more if you want, but the two questions that were asked were, one, what's going on with strategy at the moment? And if you work currently as an agile coach or an internal change agent, and you want to orientate yourself more towards this topic in your organization, what are the kind of things you should consider when getting started? But other
Okay,
than that, I wanted to leave the floor for you for the next 30 minutes.
so let me start off by sorting out context. Yeah. Um, so I've been involved in strategy either academically or method development or actually doing it for 40 plus years now. So not many people know this, but I was once actually a deputy financial director. I try not to tell too many people about that because they might get the wrong impression. Um, And one of the things you're always doing there is I was in the strategy role within finance. So the role there is to make sure you have the resources available for what you need to do and to do that on a distributed basis. Yeah. And so that was several years of my life. And then myself and the financial director knew the company was going to go bankrupt and nobody was listening to us. So we both left. I could have left and carried on as his deputy for the rest of my life, but I'd probably earned more money doing that, to be honest. But I decided I wanted to split out. So I had computing in my background, I had strategy, I had finance. It was quite a rare combination in those days. So I ended up in a company called Data Sciences, designing and building decision support systems. And the first three companies I wrote them for were Guinness PLC, Maersk Shipping, and the Vesti Group, which was then the biggest privately owned company in the UK. In fact, they were famous for only paying 1 penny in tax 1 year, and I wrote the systems which helped them do that. And I also wrote the systems which helped Guinness illegally trade on their share value. I was young and innocent in those days, all right? And then from that, I went into general management and then became strategy director of a company, and then IBM took us over. And then I went more into the academic side. So I've come from a heavy practice base, both as an actual strategist and as a consultant, and then moved into IBM strategy in terms of how did we rebrand IBM as a service company from a manufacturing company, because that's why they bought the company I work for. Yeah. So, and there's several things about that. If you actually do strategy for real, and 99% of the people who talk about strategy on the internet have got no bloody idea what actually goes on, is you pretty soon realize that actually it's bugger all to what anybody, I've got an MBA, it's bugger all to what you learn on an MBA. It's all politics and it's all nasty and it's all vicious, and you have to pay a lot of attention to weak signals. Right. And I think people need to get real about that, because the people responsible for strategy in an organization are dealing with massive amounts of pressure. I always get really irritated with agile people when they say, but C-level executives don't understand they need to do this. And you keep saying you've got no idea what pressures a C-level executive is under. You're sitting there making rational choices and presenting things. 90% of the time they're going to know you're right, but they can't do it politically because of other pressures. The other thing when you are in strategy or general management in general is, you'll get 4 or 5 minutes to make a decision between alternatives presented by people who spent 6 months researching what the right solution is, and you're meant to make a decision. Right? Now, all of that is deeply problematic because it breaks any concept that you have this rational, logical, structured process. So the first thing I want to say, and I'm going to go through several key points to build where I'm going on this, that strategy is inherently political. It is not rational. I could actually argue that the politics is rational, given the context in which we're working. We can have that debate later. but it's fundamentally a political process about resource allocation, use, and about risk reduction. Most C-level executives are driven by risk reduction. It's why SAFE was successful, because it allowed you to say you were being agile but not change, and that reduces the risk. Yeah, there were lots of other things about that, but that was part of the process. Yeah. The second thing is that strategy is actually about planning. I always get slightly irritated where people say it isn't about planning. But I want to go with a Mintzberg definition there, because Mintzberg, if I can find it, said it's a strategy is a pattern in a stream of decisions. And I really like that phrase, but I've always liked Henry's stuff anyway. He's a delight to talk with, and he's the person in the old style management consultancy academic bracket who probably gets closest to complexity science, yeah, out of all of them in that sense. So the concept of a pattern in a stream of decisions is important because it's dynamic. If you look at all the military definitions of strategy, and that's where it comes from the Greek strategos, which was the name of the governing general. It's about planning, but it's about dynamic planning. Yeah, it's not a static plan. It's effectively, and I can go to several definitions on this. Yeah, it's now I want to come to McEwen later. It's if I go back to the OED on this, sorry, I was looking at some stuff earlier. It's the art of directing large movements in battlefield. Yeah, that's the way strategy comes from a military environment, or the art of planning a future direction. Now, all of those, and notice the word art is used in both cases, not science. Yeah, that's important. And in both cases, they're dynamic. The assumption is you are living in a situation where you need to make constant adjustments. So the first thing I want to make, the second point I want to make is it's not about a static plan. It's not a document which you write and you give to your shareholders. It's about a dynamic process of planning, yeah, and constantly adjusting those plans, which is strategy, yeah, and that has to be directed in some way. And the third thing is I want to thank McEwen. McEwen said it was all about shaping the future. He was both McEwen, rather like Henry Mintzberg, is trying to move away from the static plan concept. And again, that concept of shaping the future, yeah, is again a dynamic concept, not a static concept. Yeah. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute because I want to change McEwen's phrase and say it's not about shaping the future. It's about shaping the present in order to enable a better future. Yeah, and I'm going to come back and describe that in a minute because that's one of the key concepts that comes out of complexity science in this respect. Yeah, but again, the concept of shaping, the concept of art, the concept of a maker, all of these concepts come into strategy. Strategy is actually more pragmatic than tactics in some ways. Yeah, you can train people to do tactics. Tactics are defined by the situation. You've got a limited range of options, whereas in strategy, it's much more dynamic. It's much more open. Yeah, in that sense. Yeah. So those are sort of three sort of base points I want to make. Yeah. The other point I want to make now, I think I'll go on to where I think it's going. If we live in an and this comes from complexity science, and I wish I'd known more about complexity science 30 years ago, yeah, in that sense. One of the things in complexity science is we know we can't know the future. And it's quite interesting. There are two groups of people who I've never had a difficulty explaining complexity to. One is anybody from an indigenous community, and the other is anybody with 3 or more stars on their shoulder. 2 stars can be a problem, but 3 stars ain't. Yeah. Because the reality of command at that level is, and Clausewitz's famous quote, "No plan survives the first encounter with the enemy." Right. Now it's interesting. I was at a NATO command. I'm working on NATO Future of Joint Forces Command at the moment. I'm back in Lisbon before I go on to the Ukraine next week. And they're currently working on the next level of doctrine. And this is actually quite scary because all of these presenters were coming through. We're talking about 5 forces, land, sea, air, space, and cyber. I'm arguing heavily they need to introduce a 6th, which is civilians. because civilians are charged part of a modern military strategy. You can't separate them from the military process anymore. You can see plenty of examples out in the Ukraine. But they're all quoting Clausewitz. And because they're in peacetime, they're producing, systems engineering diagrams of military strategy. I mean, literally, it looks like something from PMI in the 1960s. All right. Sorry, PMI's on my mind at the moment for obvious reasons. So it's highly structured, it's highly planned. I'm sat there with a bunch of 3-stars, and I said, "Are you ever going to use this?" And they said, "No, but we'll have to put a lieutenant colonel on to tick in the boxes so that everybody thinks we're doing it." Right? And that's a very common thing at command level. You end up having people do things so that you do what you need to do, but other people sort of keep the bureaucracy in control or in harm. Yeah. Now, to me, if no plan survives the first encounter with the enemy, then it's a bit stupid having a plan about what the output's going to be or the endpoint is. And complexity theory also says that, because it says you can't know the future, but you can understand the evolutionary potential of the present. Yeah. So I'll come back to the McEwen quote. We need to understand where we are, and we need to understand how we can shape that. And that, to me, is what I called a long time ago in one of this third Cynefin article, The New Dynamics of Strategy, a title I'm probably going to pick up and reuse again on this. Yeah. Now, in order to do that, there's several things that you need to do. So, and I'm going to run through them. So, first of all, and this is called the 3 A's, which if you haven't read my book chapter in Poley's new book on foresight, that's got those summarized, and I can put the link in the chat while I remember. So if anybody wants that, that's going to cover that. And that covers 3 things. One is affordance. Yeah, so what is made available to you by the environment you're in? That's a reference back to Gibson's work in biology. And I say my favorite way of saying this is no point in having a strategic plan to be the best grower of cacti in the world if you happen to live in a paddy field. Yeah. The environment doesn't afford the ability for you to do what you want to do. All right. So you need to understand the affordance landscape. And this is something we developed where we look at all the various factors in play. Concept called actants, which comes from actor network theory. So actants are human actors, constraints or constructors. So we map all the actants onto a grid between energy cost of change and time to change. And what that does, the top right, is called the counterfactual zone. It's a domain of things that now we know we realistically can't change them. But if somebody else could, that would actually be quite dangerous. Now, I'm doing these at high level. I can dive down deeper if people want later. The whole point about an affordance is to say, these are the things we can change. These are the things we can't change. If we red-blue team that, then we might end up with 2 maps, which is these are the things we can change. These are the things we can't change. These are the things the enemy or the competition can change, and these are the things they can't change. Now, notice at no point in this is I'm saying what I want to change or what I want to achieve. I'm first of all mapping the landscape to identify what is afforded to me and to the other players in the landscape. So that's kind of like stage 2. The other thing, and this is really important, is the belief systems. It's actually quite interesting. So I've never been in the military, but I ended up getting dumped into in the US big time to the point where I'm now considered a military decision support specialist, which scares me at times. All right. But one of the famous contrasts you make in the Second World War was the difference between Patton and Montgomery. And I should say up front now, and on the side of Patton, I think if Patton had been given the fuel instead of Montgomery, the war would have been over a year earlier, and I can defend that one. Montgomery was a planner. He was a politically savvy. He was a planner. Everything had to be planned meticulously in advance. Patton adapted on the fly. Yeah, and you can see that if you look at the bridges, the Arnhem battle, that's Montgomery. Once it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong. Yeah, whereas if you're adapting constantly by shifting patterns, that works differently. And the interesting thing about Patton, if you haven't seen the film Patton, which is brilliant, it's really worth watching. Yeah, it's an outstanding film. Is first of all, he was insane. Yeah, most wartime generals are insane, right? They're very different from peacetime generals. And there's an old adage in the British Army, You have to wait for 2 years of war for the peacetime generals to die out so the wartime generals can take over and you've got a chance of doing something. So he thought he was a reincarnation of many historical figures, including Alexander, which meant he studied all the battlefields. So he had lots of patterns available to him. Yeah. He also said he was a cavalry commander. And he said, I'm a cavalry commander, so I can look after my horse. So he learned how to strip and put together a Sherman tank. Because he said, if I don't understand how to look after this tank, how can I be a commander? And a lot of us have argued, including people with more military knowledge than I, that that's the reason that the Battle of the Bulge, Patton succeeded when Montgomery said it wasn't possible. Because he knew exactly how he could maintain those tanks, so he knew what they were capable of doing under conditions of stress and could adapt quickly. Yeah. Remember, strategy comes from strategos, which is the role of the commander. And therefore, the commander's knowledge base is key to this. But that's also an attitude. And these are two things I'm going to talk about in terms of narrative. So first of all, there was an attitude because Montgomery had succeeded in North Africa, he was now considered deified. Yeah. And therefore the attitude was he could do no wrong. Now that is what is called in narrative terms an assemblage. This is Deleuzian concept. It's a pattern of attitudes or beliefs, which is very difficult to disrupt. Now that's also important. Remember I said one of the things I'm working on with NATO is the role of military attitudes. So we're looking at the moment potentially about measuring the attitudes of the Finnish population because of the potential of an invasion from Russia. So civilian attitudes are part of battlefield planning. Well, similarly, in strategy, your staff attitudes, your staff beliefs, the belief of your customers are also critical. And those are not rational. I'm actually blogging about this at the moment in the context of the American elections. And I've said several times, part of the problem the Democrats had is that they thought they were actually marketing to Yale graduates rather than to people with emotions, feelings, and small-scale problems. Yeah. So you have to understand the attitudinal factors in play, and in large civilian populations, and in modern warfare, civilian is a part of that, civilian attitudes come into play. If you're working in a company, your employee attitudes, your customer attitudes, your competitor attitudes all map. And that's where we actually do narrative maps. Yeah? So we gather narrative at scale, and we look at patterns in those stories. Yeah, and no, there isn't any shared screen because I'm only speaking for half an hour and you all have too many bloody slides anyway. So this will force you to pay attention, right? So I'm just responding to a question in the chat. I say there are examples of this in the paper I've given. So mapping the assembly structure is to map the attitudes of the actors. And of course, that's another part of the overall affordance type landscape. And the third one, which is one of the big areas we're working on at the moment, is the concept of agency, which is what agency do you give to people in the environment? And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, right? I want to finish off with that because that's a new area of development. The other thing is you need to build lots of patterns. And I was saying before we started the recording, Patrick's book, and he's coming on shortly on patterns, I think is a really good book. But the trouble is his patterns are too coarsely grained. And this is the general problem with pattern language. Yeah, it deals with too few patterns at too coarse a grain level. What you really want is that more finely grained level. Remember I talked about pattern? Is micro memories of multiple scenes on multiple battlefields rather than archetypal battles. Right? So stop thinking archetypes, think about fragmented material. Now, one of the things we developed for that, and we first pioneered, Gary Klein and I, if you don't know Klein, he's one of the greats in sense making. Gary Klein and I did this for the first time with the Singapore Army. Is we ran a full counter-terrorist scenario over 2 days, but we did it in a human-mediated game in which nobody could succeed. I watched too much Star Trek to do my maths and physics homework when I was in my teenage years, and you can see this coming through. And the way we did that is you have 3 to 5 teams in a physical environment. You said give them a situation, and then as they assess the situation and decide what to do, the human games teams who are listening in to all the conversations continuously feed novel data to them, which is much more realistic. So they can never get a static position. They're always dealing with constant information. And as a games team, you're deliberately feeding them information to make their lives as difficult as possible. And then you blow a whistle, they tell you what they're going to do, you send them away for an hour, they come back, and whatever they did turns out to have been a total disaster. You find one thing they missed and you extrapolate from that, and then you rinse and repeat twice more. Now, interestingly, there's a full paper on this. At the end of that process, people were scanning 20 times more data than they were at the start. Because if you consistently fail, you pay more attention to novelty and weak signals than if you succeed. If you succeed, you pay attention to less. Now, that's called anthrosimulation. It's something we're bringing back into the portfolio at the moment. We want to train some more facilitators in it because continuously during that period, we're gathering fragmented narratives of what people have seen and what they think they could do, regardless of whether they did them or not, and building those into a narrative database, which we can then use in real time, when situations start to happen. So I'm here taking a military tactic, which is you train 10 times for 10 hours training for every hour in battle is a good rule of thumb. In companies, nobody does the training. Or they don't do simulation training in real time. They just get trained by academics, all right, which is not the same thing. Now, what we're doing there is we're building capability. We're using multiple actors from different backgrounds in parallel. People are continuously failing. We're building huge narrative databases, which is one of the most effective forms of knowledge management, rather than text-based best practice, in order to actually feed what people are doing downstream. Right? Now, what I'm talking about, if you think about it, is a process by which you engage in strategy, not a process by which you call in consultants, decide on your purpose, decide what you're going to try and achieve, write it down, and then propagate it. So we're moving from that sort of very top down. I have a purpose, I have objectives, I have strategy, I have tactics. And that implies that you can know in advance what the right thing is to do. And that's very common. Instead, I'm saying what we do is we actually just mess that up completely. And we really want grand strategy and tactics to be in the same time dimension. We want things to be happening in real time. We want to be constantly changing the space, which means we want to also be constantly training and experimenting in fictional environments to generate material for facts when they come to hit us downstream. And that fictional environment is really important because I'm building a biggest database of what is possible and impossible from different perspectives. And by the way, that's also where you bring in red teaming and blue teaming and all those sort of things. I can give some more examples on that later if people want. Then the final thing I want to come to is the whole concept of agency. So the reality is you can't make decisions. If you go back and you look at the work that I can never pronounce it, the German general Multke, is it Multke? Somebody can help me pronounce that. Who's the guy who really did the German
Moltke. Moltke.
Multke, that's it. So Multke is the guy who really revises German military strategy after the Franco-Prussian War, which caused them to realize they couldn't just march people in straight lines. And that creates a highly adaptive with distributed command, right? And Clausewitz sort of picks that up and elsewhere. And distributed command was really important. If you look at that in the Bulge and elsewhere in the Second World War, it gave resilience in the system because people are making decisions in the field. Now, it's important to realize this isn't just letting people make decisions. It's also about making decisions in the context of commander's intent and in the context of considerable amounts of training. There's a famous example in Stephen Bungay's book, which I like. He says one of the reasons Napoleon succeeded is he knew communication was key, but he couldn't, you couldn't find out things fast enough. So he gave everybody heuristic. If in doubt, march to the sound of the guns. And that gave predictability within the system. Right? So training people on heuristics to give predictability between cohorts is key. Commander's intent is key. Now I'll talk about commander's intent as well. So we've done a lot of work on this. And does anybody know Gettysburg? Sorry, I spend too much time with the Americans. I've now become a Civil War buff. There's only 2 Civil War battlefields I haven't been to in the States, all right? And I've got lots of videotapes. So either way, there's a key point on Gettysburg. If you don't know, Gettysburg was an accidental battle. If it had been planned, the South would probably have won it. So the South had moved north from the first time. They'd lost their cavalry. Sherman had taken it off somewhere else, so they didn't know they were going to meet the Union Army till they met them, in Gettysburg. If the Union Army had known the Confederate Army were coming, they'd probably run because McClellan was trying to avoid battle at that time anyway. So the whole bloody first day is an accident. And if Lee had realized at the cemetery that there was no resistance, the battle would have been over on day one, but he held back. On day two, there's a key incident in that Lee realizes the strategic significance of a hill called Little Round Top. If you ever go to the States, by the way, do the 3-day battlefield tour. They literally walk you around the field as it happened, and you can do it from a Confederate side and you can do it from a Union side. Yeah, and that's really fun. You can also do it in Derry, by the way. You can walk around the walls of the Troubles from a Protestant guide or a Catholic guide. And because it's Derry, if you buy both at the same time, they'll give you a discount, all right? But that's another story. So either way, on day two of Gettysburg, Lee realizes the significance of this hill. If he can get troops there with artillery, he's got a commanding field of fire, not only over the Union Army, but also over their reserves. Battle is over. And by the way, if Gettysburg had gone the other way, and it almost did, the US would have broken up. Lincoln would not have won the election, etc. It's one of the big turning points in history. So either way, a guy called it, this is partly a narrative. It's not quite true, but it's a story everybody knows. Is a guy called Chamberlain who'd been trained in a Midwest college. He hadn't gone to West Point, so he was fairly naive, realized the significance at the same time, got a troop up there and held against several charges from the South, and did the only successful northern bayonet charge to drive the southern troops off Little Round Top. And the whole battlefield changes from that point. After that, it's all over. Now, Pickett's charge finishes on day 3. Now, if I say Little Round Top, no Chamberlain, do you see what I'm doing? I'm referencing a commonly understood story, but I'm introducing a counterfactual, a reversal. So in 4 words, I'm conveying a highly complex battlefield scenario, rather than have to write 5 or 6 pages. Right? Now, that's something we're now looking at in corporate terms, is you use commonly understood narrative with counterfactual points to allow you to convey very complex ideas in very short, small number of words, which is also vital in multilingual environments. And that means that you haven't conveyed a precise instruction, you've conveyed an ambiguous instruction, but with a general sense of direction, which allows distributed command or business managers or ordinary staff to make the right decisions. Now, the next stage beyond that, which we're working on at the moment, is role-based decision-making groups. So we evolved to make decisions in teams and whatever. So small groups of people, the sort of group of 5, the hunter-gatherer community, we will always compromise in a group of 5 or 7 because it's an extended family size. So the work we're currently doing, which we'll announce a research group for in a few weeks' time. So if anybody wants, they can join that research group and be part of the full development of the methods. There'll be an NDA, but that's limited, right? It will go open source. It will go open source at the end of the process. Is if we can identify 4 roles and an anonymous 5th role, we can authorize that role combination to spend money or make significant decisions, because the anonymity produces a panopticon effect, honesty, and the roles introduce cognitive diversity into the decision process. Right? Now, the whole point about moving into distributed decision making is to allow lots and lots of small decisions to be made within structure. And by the way, when people do that, they're called context, decision, and consequence. And for me to look at the pattern in lots of small decisions being made in real time to reinforce or disrupt as I'm running strategy as a dynamic process. Now, you may or may not have got that. That to me is probably the most important thing I've done in the last decade. Because we're also looking at that of end-of-life decision for children in hospital. We're looking at it to take out 50% of the bureaucracy in British hospitals. Is you move to allow people not to make decisions as individuals or not to make decisions as teams, but to make decisions in role combinations, because people are trained in roles and role expectation, and the cognitive behavior is very different in that context. Okay, so I've used up my half hour, so kind of let me summarize on this. Fundamentally, strategy needs to be a dynamic process. We need to shape the present in order to help shape the future. We don't start with shaping the future. We don't start with where we want to be and try and close the gap. We start with where we are. That means we need to map affordances, we need to map assemblages, we need to have real-time feedback loop on that. We need to better communicate intent. We need to do mass rehearsals of multiple alternatives in lots of small teams and build knowledge databases from that. And we need to distribute decision making so strategic decisions can be made by people at all levels in an organization with fast feedback mechanisms so that we can see what works and doesn't work. And that is a very different approach to strategy than most of the ones you'll read in the textbooks, but that's coming from complexity science. Okay, I've gone 1 minute over. So that's the summary.
Thank you, Dave. I know we are a lot of people on the line, but still not everybody showed up. So let's just try to open up the floor. So please use walkie-talkie style, so one at a time. Eduardo.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Well, first, greetings from Mexico. Thank you so much for the information. And I had the terrible fortune of studying philosophy. So I was thinking about the concept of time in Bergson way of viewing time. And the problem of language. I mean, about the thing is, how can you turn Montgomery C-suites to patent style C-suites without letting them die or leaving the company? How can you drive them insane in a practical sort of way to view strategy this way?
Line them up against the wall with a firing squad is actually quite a good solution if you think about it. I mean, one of the reasons the British Navy was so successful is that there were 3 people who were farmers pulled off the port and conscripted as seamen who became admirals because they were competent. And when one admiral retreated in the face of overwhelming odds, they court-martialed him and shot him on the deck of his ship just to teach everybody else a lesson. So there are points about this, all right? Which I'd recommend. First of all, I think you need to be very careful with Bergson. All right. Sorry, I also study philosophy. At the moment, I'm talking about time in the sense of chronos in terms of linear time. But if you think about it, there's a very strong element of kairos, the right time, in what I've just talked about. And there's a whole anthropology of time, which I think goes beyond where Bergson was. And I think the physics of time has changed radically. If you look at the modern philosophy of physics and time, that's changing radically from Bergson. Yeah. And part of that is the growing body of view, which actually says that information may have momentum. Yeah? So if information has momentum, that changes the way in which we see information on time. So I'm agreeing it's important. I'm being cautious about Bergson. Yeah. Also because trying to explain Bergson to anybody who hasn't studied an obscure branch of philosophy is impossible anyway. So if you can't explain it, nobody's going to do anything with it as it happens, all right? But I think the concept of chronos and kairos is an important one. And I think there's also, and I'm waiting for the Greek on this, but there's also the concept of, I mean, I've been involved in 3 near-fatal car accidents in my life, all right? Time slows down. I still remember when a car I was driving turtled on the M25, right? Literally we rolled and hit a crash barrier on the side. We were really lucky. The police estimated it took a minute. I thought it took 10 minutes. I actually got the windows open, the doors unlocked, and the fire extinguisher out before we stopped. Right? So humans are capable of things and for short term under extreme stress, and time dilates or changes in that context. All right. So I think we need to do a lot more on that, and some of the simulations will work on that. But in terms of changing things, the secret is not to change them. You don't go in and say, we've got a whole new approach to strategy. You say, that stuff you're doing on strategy, wouldn't it be better if we understood what was possible first? So, a couple of half days, we'll map what we can change, and that will reduce the risk of the conventional approach. Well, shouldn't we measure the attitudes? Well, let's just try that. Those decisions are a bit difficult. Maybe you don't want to do them. Maybe we should delegate those. Maybe we can improve your communication. You don't go in with something radically new. You go in with small things based on what they're already doing. I mean, it would be hypocritical to say change, all right? We're saying you have to start with where things are. Well, that applies to the decision makers as well. Yeah, Socratic approaches are, I mean, I use them a lot, but you have to be aware that the people of Athens did get to the point where Socrates was forced to drink hemlock, all right? There's a limit to how much people will tolerate you playing that one.
Someone is asking where's the hand, so you simply just raise your hand using
Or you just shout out.
or just speak out. It seems to be going well.
Okay, there's a hand.
Go ahead, Steve.
If I can just try and thread some things. Stanley McChrystal,
Yeah.
teams, and the way he was. It's a mixture of a bit of commander's intent, which Maciejewski used in 2nd Battalion in Iraq as well, and mashed up with some of McChrystal's approaches. With like some, I mentioned this actually in a masterclass a while ago, and I think you misheard who I was referencing. It's Jeff Skunk Baxter, the guitar player in Steely Dan, who now
Okay.
he's one of the asymmetrical warfare defense experts, Department of
Okay.
Defense, and so it's like what it seems like you're doing is you're threading in the overall, let's say, supporting architecture for strategy. You're taking all these different ideas and sort of threading them through with complexity to create a completely new way of managing strategy.
Yeah, I think what we've always said we do is we use natural science as an enabling constraint. And it took me a long time to get Michael Jackson to understand this, and I don't think he has yet. It's like he kept saying you can't use a scientific approach on human systems because there are too many variables. And I said, yes, there are. Yeah, so we're not doing that. What we do is we say, what does natural science tell us that we can rely on? And then we build methods and tools, which are coherent to that. So that's the enabling constraint thing. So yes, we are threading it, and I am trying to make the whole thing coherent and hang together. And the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of the stuff I've been working on for 3 decades has finally started to, using common language and common themes across it. Stan is quite interesting. He used Cynefin extensively in Afghanistan. If you go into the second book, it's listed. And I mean, Stan famously, I mean, I always quote this against systems dynamics. He famously looked at the systems dynamics map of Afghanistan in the Pentagon and said, if we ever understand that, we've won the battle. And the people who produced it thought it was a compliment, which is even more scary, right? The reality, and what he also did was to distribute command. That was one of the ideas where I said, well, yeah, how do I do, I mean, this is classic for me, all right? I mean, I knew Petraeus as well. You basically look at what they do and say, these are brilliant generals. How the fuck do I scale that? Right? Now, if I can get to the science, I can find a way to scale it. Yeah, I don't want to be reliant on brilliant individuals. Yeah, and that's where we're coming from. The asymmetric warfare is interesting because the original work, and I wouldn't mind a reference on that if you could pop it in the chat. The origins of stuff is the work I did with John Poindexter in DARPA, where we were looking at asymmetric threat. And what the thing we came up with then, which actually drove the development of SenseMaker, is we need hugely distributed, cognitive, diverse human sensor networks. Because governments can deploy those and then they can get asymmetric advantage over the terrorist. Because the terrorist can't access that level of cognition. But again, that's a distributed cognition thing coming into play there.
So the last just to complete the thread, the connect. What's the connect between the knowledge stroke narrative database and then the role combinations, distributed decision making, and the connection between
one feeds the other. So the role combination is people interacting with other people, yeah, and operating within a role, not as individuals. Right. So one of the reasons you see roles used extensively in military environments, and military environments, people will confess to failure, which they won't in a civilian environment. The reason is, and this was, oh God, Carl Weick found this in the book with Sutcliffe on high reliability organizations. So he studied organizations where people shared failure. And I remember at a conference, I said, but you're working with crews. And then I stupidly said, I can, if I don't want to burn the office down every morning to get people to share failure, but that didn't go down well with Carl, right? Because the people he studied were crews. Crews, people share failure because it's part of the role to share failure after deployment. Yeah, and it's micro after deployment. It's not macro retrospectively over time.
Yeah, this is also SAS practice.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is fundamental, right? So, and one of the things we did in Afghanistan is we had company commanders keeping narrative records in the field under fire in return for not writing patrol reports. Yeah, and that again is part of strategy because that gives you real-time human interpretation together with other data so you can dynamically adjust your plans. Now, I can't overemphasize this, you know. You used to think how many companies have gone under because their planning cycle was too long, so they couldn't adapt. One of the major disasters in IT was SAP, because it meant the time it took to reconfigure your software was now longer than the time it took for a market to change. Right? So you couldn't respond. Your technology couldn't respond to market changes. The life cycles were different.
Thanks. Very cool. It's not a slight compliment. It's totally coherent.
Oh, thank you. Estuarine mapping is we're debating whether estuarine mapping is the whole of the 3As or just the affordance mapping. The estuary is a really powerful metaphor, so we're thinking actually the estuary is a better metaphor for the whole approach to strategy. Yeah, and then the other methods fit within that, and I think that's where we'll go. Go, Steve.
A little follow-up. I can't remember who it was I read now, but it's about level of abstraction or granularity.
Yeah.
And always I'm still on this connection between the narrative databases and then the role combinations. The level of complexity of the appropriateness of the solution should fit the level of complexity of the.
Yes and no. I think the key thing is the way the human brain works, all right, and that we all would try, if we can, replicate the way the human brain works in an IT system, because it's more likely to get picked up, is you're constantly micro-hallucinating based on multiple sensory data. And then you're fusing those micro-hallucinations together in the first coherent pattern you apply. Now, the way a narrative database works, because it's very finely grained, is you ask a high abstraction question. You can't ask a precise question. And you get thrown 15 or 20 or 30 anecdotes, and you fuse those together, and that gives you a course of action. Right? What you don't want is a single pattern or a single recipe. Yeah, you want the ingredients that you can reassemble. So the way narrative databases work is, so for example, on my Afghanistan one, yeah, company commanders were basically capturing a story. They could take a picture or speak or write or any combination, and they placed that onto 6 triangles, which were drawn from military doctrine. They could then say, if I knew the answer to the problem I've got, I'd probably index it in this area of that triangle and this area of that triangle, then the system would recall everything indexed that way by other people. So that is a high abstraction metadata search, which is radically different from a text-based or an AI-based search, because it's using abstractions and human metadata as a search mechanism. So that allows for abductive or chance discovery, which is what you need in strategy. Yeah.
So it's still disintermediated.
Don't disintermediate it. And I mean, we did that. We did 2 other big pilot projects on that. Because we had the human metadata, we weren't waiting for patrol reports. So that meant we had data in real time. We could combine that with traditional data, and we could actually create, and this is where AI does come in, and we've done a lot of work with predictive AI. It allows you to create the sort of training data sets that tell people there may be an IED in this area, be careful. And I think that's the other big thing on strategy, which is you want to alert people when they should pay attention, because people will not see things unless they're told to pay attention because something might be different, which I've got to add into the blog tomorrow, come to think of it. Yeah.
Dave, I have a question, a little bit going back to the 2 original questions, where I think you covered the first really well. But imagine that you are in a place where you have been working as a senior agile coach, so you're like well versed to surround senior leaders, but nobody really wants to do this agile thing anymore. They are going to the other corner of the PMI Agile Alliance thingy.
I was quite pleased when that happened.
The only thing that's not changing is the strategy. How can you become more relevant in that context if you want to work yourself into strategy as a new topic building on your?
Okay, so 2 or 3 things. I mean, the Agile Alliance being effectively bought by PMI is, some of us predicted that a year ago when they didn't manage to make the procurement of DAD or the shallow way work. Yeah. So what you've got is an end game consolidation of structured approaches. And that always happens at the end of a life cycle. The minute SAFE came out, myself and a few others started to work on the Hexi approach in Agile because we said the space is now going to be there for something new. When commoditization happens, that's when you start to work on the new thing. Yeah. So, and we're talking with Dave and others on this at the moment. We think actually Agile is going to split into, do you want a consolidated certification PMI with Agile elements thing, or do you want an open source Hexi, assemble things from multiple components? And that's only ever going to be about 13 to 20% of the market. Because people forget this, all right? New things are adopted by at most 20% of a market. All right. So if you want to do something radically new, there are some companies where, to be honest, you can't do it because they'll wait for other people to do it first. All right. So that's one thing you've got to think about. All right. But the other thing is, I think you can reduce the effort. Now, I said it earlier, but I'll repeat it and spend more time on it. One of the ways we sell, affordance mapping, that's part of Estuarine Mapping, is it's 2 half days and we can reduce the risk on a conventional project. Yeah. So if you're going to talk to conservative directors of companies, you talk about two things: risk reduction, cost reduction. Those are the only things that will get them to pay attention. So if we can reduce the risk on a project by mapping what can be changed and what can't be changed and where change will be very expensive, that's something which will appeal to them. And if it only costs 2 half days and then we can instantiate it into software later, that's a good message. Yeah. So complexity starts by doing small things and getting people used to them. So, for example, if we take employee engagement surveys, which most executives, OR people have CEOs in a Stockholm Syndrome relationship. CEOs can never understand the employee engagement survey, but they have to do them. We can capture narrative continuously from employees. We can therefore give you continuous feedback on employee culture and attitudes. If anybody hasn't seen that, we've now got that available for people to try out, for under £1,000, right? I'll put the link into that on there, yeah. We don't sell that as replacing the engagement survey. We say, well, you don't understand the engagement survey. Why don't you run this? Then you might understand the engagement survey and then wait for them to realize they can drop the engagement survey and replace it, yeah. A friend of mine years ago in knowledge management coined a phrase which I wish I'd coined. He said, we need Trojan mice. Yeah, Trojan mice is a lovely concept, right? So what you do is you do little things which address concerns they've got. There's a big issue. I've got to allocate money to this project. I've got to allocate 20 million. Who do I give it to? Well, if we ran this program with 50,000 of that and saw what worked and didn't work, we could actually reduce your risk on the big allocation. Oh, that's interesting. Not, I've got this wonderful new method for distributed decision making. We should adopt it. That won't work. Yeah, you've got to listen to people and find out what their issue is and then bring the new techniques in to help address those issues. But just keep breaking it into your mind. Risk reduction, cost reduction. Those are the only two things that matter for executives at the moment. And by the way, it's their personal risk that matters, which is why they will employ McKinsey's, because they won't get fired for implementing a McKinsey's report. Yeah, again, remember where I started on this. C-level is all politics and it ain't nice. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Otherwise, Dave, I have one more question.
Go for it.
So Cynefin offers different domains, and
Yeah.
everything is not complex, for example, but it has aspects of complexity. So in your story around strategy that you shared today, is that a fusion with other types of strategy, or do you think that as an overarching approach to also cover
At
other?
some stage, well, let me give the illustration. So I've said to Patrick, but he's not listening. Look, we can take what you've done on patterns, but we need to break it down into smaller grains. Yeah. So you relate to things by changing them, not by just saying everybody's ideas are equally good. Yeah, that won't work. Yeah. So top-down approaches, I think, are wrong. But if you need a top-down approach, make sure it's sufficiently bland and anodyne that it can be adapted for anything. And most strategy is bland and anodyne anyway. It's just a collection of platitudes. Yeah. So live with it. But so we can find ways to interface. All right. So say I can work with pattern languages. I don't see any point in working with VSM or with systems dynamics. I can work with soft systems. Yeah. So some things you can work with, but you can work with by you changing and them changing and whatever in combination. And that's the piece of work we need to do. Yeah. But I think, I mean, so the open strategy book, which is really helping me with the business plan I'm putting in at the moment, because I'm basically saying, guys, you see this, isn't it wonderful? We can do everything that they spend 6 months in 1 hour. Right? That's the difference. All right. So if we need to get our employees engaged, we need to consult them. We can't do that explicitly in multiple workshops over months. We've got to do it in real time, in minutes, if necessary. And we can set up systems to do that. So again, I'm linking with something, taking it, but then changing it. And that's what complexity science really does if it's done properly. The other thing everybody gets wrong about Cynefin is about moving things between domains, not about the domains. Yeah, if you can make, I mean, the reason Scrum is a brilliant set of methods is it makes complex things complicated. Not because it's a complex technique, but it makes complex things complicated so they can be delivered as software. That's its power. All right. So Cynefin is about moving things between domains, not just saying it's in this, it's not a categorization framework, it's a dynamic framework. Yeah. Greg? I saw Greg had his hand up.
Yes, I just popped something in the chat, but very conscious that a lot of this works really well if you are in the C-suite level and you're actually on the exec side of things. But for traditional British boards that meet occasionally and have got used to signing off strategies and leaving the tactics to the exec, I see a fairly big culture change as being necessary. So are we looking, I mean, do we even have any models for what boards might need to look like in order to move beyond a traditional distinction where the board decides what we're going to do and then the exec decides how we're going to do it? If we're going to entangle tactics with strategy, it seems a little bit I mean, I can see that nothing's going to change if boards carry on operating in the same ways.
I think boards are irrelevant. You're working with some of the executive and you're principally working with senior management, the ones just below board level. They're the people who really do strategy. All right. And they're the ones you have to sell to.
Yeah.
And operate with. The new fad question, what's fascinating now, seeing a resurrection of old fads. So blue ocean strategy, which was also always a bloody nonsense, is suddenly coming back in again. Yeah, because people like the idea of dichotomies, right? So you're seeing some of the old strategies recycling, which is actually, I think, a good sign for those of us in complexity science, because I think systems thinking has run out of options on strategy. Yeah, it just hasn't got anything else it can contribute, whereas complexity can contribute something significantly different. And that idea that information has momentum, think about that. That's coming out of 3 branches of physics at the moment.
Also, that information has mass.
That would imply, well, that's where it gets controversial, right? So momentum is one thing, mass is another. If it has mass, then it explains dark matter. And that would fit in with theoretical biology, but you've got to be more cautious there. So I'm staying with momentum for the moment. I want Roger Penrose to talk to me again this May because I value my conversations with Roger every May at Hay Festival. And if I said that too publicly, he wouldn't talk with me anymore. So.
Okay, 5 minutes to go. Anyone who is sitting on a question, now is the chance. Or anything you like to ask us, Dave, which is just to...
No, I mean, 2 or 3 things. We are going to... hundreds of... Sorry, I was just clicking on a link. I shouldn't have done that. Apologies before the chat went. Several things, all right? One of the things we did on Estuarine is we developed it in open source, and that was actually a mistake. I'm glad I did it because I learned from it. Because what we found is people, instead of working with us to continue it, would grab bits they understood and then take them to market prematurely. And that's not what it was meant to be about. Yeah. Now, I don't blame them. We didn't stop them. We didn't prod it. So that's fine. All right. So we're going to announce 3 or 4 what are going to be called development clubs as part of a rebadging of our membership scheme. And people can join those clubs, at which point they'll sign an agreement that they will not release the material prematurely and they'll contribute to the body as a whole. And we'll commit to open source it at the end of it. So we're going to announce those shortly. Distributed decision making is going to be the first up. Yeah. And we want people who can both help on the theory, but can also do the experiments and run the practice. But we don't want to release it into the public until we've got it worked out, where, we take a theoretical physics approach. You start with the theory, one day it looks beautiful, so then you work into practice and then you give it. So it's sort of theoretical physics, applied physics, and then it's engineering. Yeah, so I don't want these things to go into the engineering phase until we really work them out in some detail. So those will be announced shortly. The quick sense I gave you, that is designed, there's 3 of them at the moment. 2 are culture ones, one with for agile people, one with comic agile, and one with gaping void. And there's another one on attitudes to AI, which has been heavily field tested with big pharma. Yeah. Now those are designed to let people spend less than £1,000 and actually have 3 months of capture and a weekly report. So they don't have to engage in consultancy. And we think that's one of the ways you convert conservative people into this new way of thinking. Yeah, that's under £1,000. That's nothing. Once people start to see data, start to see patterns, start to see the narratives of their staff, they'll start to realize there's wider potential for that. So we're actually producing products to make that process easier to get people bound in. Yeah, I put the link in earlier.
I think it didn't come through, Dave. I don't know what happened. At least I didn't see it.
Okay.
Maybe it was a private chat.
Oh, yes. I'm sending everything to Sherry. Sorry about that.
Well, lucky her
There you are.
or him. Thank you. And you had a third point.
Did I?
Not necessarily, but that's what you said. Sorry.
No, that's probably me saying 3 and hoping I'll think of the third before I finish the second, which normally works out, but I forgot it this time.
Nice reservation. Well, 2 minutes to go, so maybe it's time to offer our thanks and end with style. So Dave, thank you a lot. Really,
Yeah, real pleasure.
it's a new field for me, as I said, and you're really one of the persons who come across in the field with the most innovating thoughts and the most radical thoughts. So also looking forward to follow. Especially one thing I think we didn't cover so well today was about the risk side. You covered it a little bit, but that's one thing
Yeah, the risk matrix is good. That's going into one of the development groups.
Okay, very well. I think we're at our end, so thank you everybody for joining.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Dave, and enjoy the rest of your walks, and hope to see you soon again.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
Thank
and
you.
thanks for arranging all.
Bye all.
You.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you.